Thank you for joining us for the second part of today's program with the panel Reframing Early American Art Collections. We will continue the symposium with talks from Elizabeth S. Humphrey, Dr. Janine Yorimoto-Bolt, and Michael Hartman. Dr. N. Strockman-Cross will be introducing the panel dedicated to curatorial research and projects that engage critically with permanent collections of early American art and also address histories of enslavement and ideologies of colonialism. Dr. N. Strockman-Cross is assistant teaching professor of American art at the Pennsylvania State University. She contributed to the exhibition's publication with the essay Questions of Recovery in Photographic History. As a quick reminder, closed captioning is available by activating the CC button at the bottom of your screen. There will be time for Q&A after the session, after everyone's presence. So please share your question in the Q&A feature, and I'll also be using the chat to share more details about the speakers. And now I'll hand it over to Anne Cross. Please a warm welcome to her and our panelists. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mathilde. Good afternoon, everyone. I also want to thank really quickly Mathilde and Richard for their efforts in organizing these events, as well as to the curatorial team of Emily Javalt, R.L. Watson, and Sade Ayuridne for putting together such a thoughtful and compelling exhibition. I'm grateful for the invitation to participate in this symposium, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation with the three scholars that joined us this afternoon. So I am a scholar of 19th century photography and print culture, and my own research has focused on the circulation of photographic images of atrocity, including images of anti-Black violence during the Civil War and the Civil War mass press. In my work, I examine how the mediation of narratives of violence can elevate certain aspects of a subject's experience while obfuscating others. While acknowledging that no narrative history will ever be able to represent or communicate the full lived experience of an enslaved or a formerly enslaved person or redress violence enacted upon them, my work seeks to redress the violence of the archive by recovering details of subjects' lives and describing as fully as possible the conditions that determine their appearance and dictate their silence within the archive. My work thus aims to widen the gap between historical narratives and the totality of a subject's lived experience so that audiences may better understand how, in the case of my research on the Civil War mass press, how the historic white press used photography and reproductive media to promote and navigate the human and ethical stakes of the Civil War and emancipation. Photography, as I note in my essay for the Unnamed Figures exhibition catalog, poses a unique challenge to the exhibition's broader engagement with questions of historical recovery. Photography's indexicality, as art historians refer to it, or its ability to register the real world through the processes of light and chemistry, serves as a form of incontestable evidence that the subjects in front of the camera were once actually there. With photographs of unnamed figures, or figures about whom little is known, our approach to the object becomes more complex, as they simultaneously register a subject's undeniable presence and the absence of their knowability. This combination of absence and presence makes these objects generative in our imagination, as they call out to the viewer to fill the gaps in the subject's narrative, to imagine the world off frame, and to make our understanding of the subject whole. In my essay for the exhibition catalog, I compare two photographs. One, a daguerreotype of a formerly enslaved woman named Nancy Toni, and the other, a carte de visite of a once known, now unknown African-American woman in the Harriet Hayden albums at the Boston Athenaeum, to illuminate the possibilities and limits for the photographic medium to represent the lived experiences and freedoms of Black Americans in the mid to late 19th century. Drawing upon the different forms of the photographs as well as their uses in circulation, I note how the diverse materials and varying uses of 19th century photography can contribute to our understanding of photographic subjects, particularly in the absence of archival information about their actual lives and identities. What I find compelling about this comparison is that in the case of Nancy Toni, we know her name and we know that she labored in the household of the Loomis family, who later held on to this photograph. And yet, despite her status as a known subject, the photograph does not necessarily represent her agency or subjecthood. but rather, as I argue, delimits her experience and identity to that of a domestic servant. And to make this argument, I note that the photograph served as a source for a painting later made by Osbert Loomis, which shows Toni in a domestic setting by a spinning wheel, much as she would have labored in the Loomis household. I then compare Toni's photograph to the carte visites found within the Harriet Hayden albums. The Harriet Hayden albums are 2 albums of carte visite photographs, which were compiled and gifted to Harriet Bell Hayden, a self-emancipated African-American woman who was a leader in Boston's Black abolitionist community in the 19th century. And I do want to note that the Athenaeum is in the process of displaying a large exhibition devoted to the Hayden album, so I hope everyone joins me and gain a chance to go see those. Many of the subjects in the Hayden albums are known to us today, including members of Frederick Douglass's family and the activist performer Louise Moutry, but many remain unnamed. Their identities, now lost to history, were likely well known to the album's compilers and beholders, and thus their naming was not required to appreciate their likeness. This is unlike why so many Black Americans remain unnamed in the archive. Though many historians associate anonymity with enslavement, the unknown figures in the Hayden albums invert these expectations and reposition anonymity within the context of freedom. As I state in my essay, there's so much more that the photograph, regardless of its privileged status as visual evidence and regardless of its process, is unable to capture, including resilience in the face of racial and gendered oppression, the bonds of kinship, and subjects' feelings about emancipation. This absence, however, leaves space for other newer narratives to be told, ones that invite us to recalibrate our approach to photograph as evidence of a subject's undeniable presence, and that instead engage the lack or the void beyond photographs of unnamed subjects. In her foreword to the exhibition catalog, Gwendolyn Du Bois-Shaw argues that new paths and methodologies are needed to tell the stories of those who have always been present even when they have not been seen. In my work, Emerging Strategies of Archivally Informed Speculative History, what Martha Hodes calls leaps of grounded imagination, or what Sadia Hartman has creatively theorized as critical fabulation, offers an especially productive pathway for future inquiry, one that is less tightly bound to the traditional empirical frameworks of historical scholarships and which attends to absences within the archive. By using archival research to contextualize and creatively imagine the unseen worlds that subjects inhabited off-frame, these new approaches transform photographs of unnamed subjects from mere registrations of a subject's past presence into memorializations of the unknowable boundlessness of Black life in the 19th century. I feel privileged because as a scholar and writer and teacher of American art history, I can employ methodologies that allow me to think and teach and write beyond the singular object or the visual evidence at hand, and beyond the available archives which are governed largely by the oppressive classes. But what does it mean to do museum work in the context of absence? Museum work presents a unique challenge to these efforts at narrating diverse histories, not least because museums privilege objects. We must ask, how can a curator present the reality of American history in all its diversity and complexity if a museum is filled with a collection that is overwhelmingly white? Or to put it colloquially, how can we tell a story of Black life and Black experience with so much white stuff? The three scholars that will be presenting this afternoon are grappling with these very questions. In their contributions to our discussion today, these speakers will be sharing their curatorial perspectives and examples of interventions that they have made in museum galleries, as they attempt to use permanent collections of early American art to tell more diverse, equitable, and inclusive histories, including histories of the minoritized and the unseen. I'll close my remarks by introducing our speakers. Our first speaker, Elizabeth Humphrey, is a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Delaware, where her research examines Blackness, identity formation, and racial construction in early North American art and material culture. Humphrey is also the former curatorial assistant and manager of student programs at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and she'll be sharing insights from her experience at Bowdoin with us today. Our second speaker, Janine Yorimoto-Bolt, is the Collection Reinstallation Project Associate at the Chazen Museum of Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she is involved in planning the comprehensive reinstallation of the permanent collection galleries. Prior to her arrival at the Chazen Museum, Yorimoto-Bolt received her PhD in American Studies from William & Mary, and her groundbreaking research uncovers how Indigenous people and people of African descent influenced the development and creation of early American art, especially portraiture. Our third and final speaker will be Michael Hartman. Hartman is the Jonathan Little Cohen Associate Curator of American Art at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College and a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Delaware. In his research and curatorial practice, Hartman seeks to critically reframe and redefine approaches to art made in North America. And at the Hood Museum, he has employed a radical thematic organization as opposed to a chronological framework to broaden the museum's ability to incorporate a multitude of art histories. I hope you'll join me in welcoming all three speakers as I invite our first speaker, Elizabeth Humphrey, to share her screen.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion on reframing early American art collections. I want to start by saying that the term early American art often brings to mind artistic traditions from colonial British America, which lend themselves to predominantly Western and Anglo studies. The art and material culture of this period are also intertwined with fraught histories of enslavement and settler colonialism. As Anne mentioned previously, my work examines early North American art through the lenses of Blackness, identity formation, racial construction, and visual culture. And these subjects often require me to reckon with presence and absence in archival and museum collections. Issues such as unnaming, misnaming, dissociating, and omitting present considerable challenges to activating Black presence in American art collections and museum exhibitions. During my 2-year appointment as the curatorial assistant at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, or BCMA for short, I had the opportunity to co-curate 2 exhibitions, African/American, 2 Centuries of Portrait in 2019, and in 2021, Reframing the Collection, New Considerations in European and American Art from 1475 to 1875. Both exhibitions drew from the BCMA's permanent collection, except for a handful of loans, and my colleagues and I had to think creatively about expanding the narratives we presented with the works available. We also needed to ensure our interpretations were accessible to various audiences, which included undergraduates, faculty, K through 12 classes, and the local community. Today, I want to reflect on these experiences and share several strategies that informed our approaches to African/American and reframing the collection. First, I'll contextualize the BCMA's permanent collection and then discuss the circumstances and strategies for each exhibition. I want to emphasize at the beginning that both projects were collaborative efforts, and I will incorporate my co-curators' perspectives when discussing each project. I firmly believe that intervening in the permanent collection begins with knowing your institution's collecting and exhibition history. So when I joined the BCMA in 2019, I compiled institutional histories of exhibitions between 1950 and 2019. From this research, I discovered 15 temporary exhibitions related to African American art, artists, and subjects during this nearly 70-year period. This count did not include the 7 temporary exhibitions of African art. The limited number of shows connected to Afro-diasporic people and art could be attributed to what I might describe as the whiteness of the permanent collection. My assessment is based on the predominance of white, often male artists, white subjects, and Anglo-dominant histories that are found in the BCMA's permanent collection. My observation is also supported by exhibition research conducted for my 2021 show, There is a Woman in Every Color, which revealed that less than 1% of the BCMA's holdings were relevant to my project. I do not wish to disregard recent efforts made by the museum to broaden its collection, and these circumstances are not unique to the BCMA. However, my statements do demonstrate a systemic problem in mainstream cultural institutions. The disparities found in permanent collections make it difficult to excavate and display diverse and overlooked histories, especially those related to Black communities and other people of color. The significance and scope of this work cannot and should not rest on one person's shoulders. So in the case of African/American and reframing the collection, a collaborative approach was critical to developing each project. It was essential to work as a curatorial team, engage in multiple rounds of feedback and review, and solicit input from faculty, outside scholars, and descendant communities. My co-curators and I aimed to reckon with the collection, and our objective was to determine how the collection, as it existed, could reveal new histories. African/American, 2 Centuries of Portraits was a temporary exhibition in the fall of 2019. The exhibition accompanied the 50th anniversary of Bowdoin's Africana Studies Department and African American Society, and it was on view while alums attended the celebratory weekend. Our student curator, Lauren Dove, class of 2021, initially asked me to help expand the show's original concept and move beyond the United States and the male-focused checklist. Lauren and I browsed the permanent collection to see what artworks aligned with this new expansive approach. Our efforts inevitably brought attention to several works that had not been displayed much since their acquisition. The resulting exhibition then moved across time and borders to highlight the relevance and legacies of Blackness in early America. At first glance, our checklist seemed like a disparate selection of objects only linked together by their relation to Blackness. However, transhistorical approaches and the exhibition layout helped us bring relevance to early American objects, despite the significant absence of relevant material. Our installation was organized with early objects primarily on the left or at center, and you can see both Daniel and Abner Coker joined together in the center. And then we had most of the 20th century objects on the right. We intended for viewers to make visual connections between past and present and allow works to speak across the room to one another. An example of this design and interpretive strategy is a selection of 3 objects that touched on Black labor. We spaced them throughout the exhibition to give viewers enough time to digest information before moving to the next related work. And you can see in the sort of far left corner, there's one albumin print there, and then the other 2 objects are featured on the right wall. As viewers moved around the gallery, they first encountered the 1862 albumin print, Gone to the Field, Hopkinson's Edisto Island, South Carolina. Henry P. Moore's photograph shows Black laborers on a farm facing an uncertain legal status. First enslaved on Edisto Island, they were now on the Union-occupied coast of South Carolina, and most plantation owners had already evacuated the area. This legacy of labor and status continued with Sebastião Salgado's cast of thousands, Serra Pelada, Brazil, done in 1986. The specks you see across the image actually represent several thousands of gold miners. This image demonstrated to Lauren the continued exploitation of Black labor due to intergenerational poverty and limited opportunities. 4 images from Danny Lyon's series Conversations with the Dead from 1971 rounded out our theme of labor. The photos, including cotton pickers, bottom right on the screen, connected enslavement and the 13th Amendment to the harsh labor permitted in the US carceral state. African/American did not represent early America in the traditional sense. Several works were produced in the 20th century. Despite the limited collection of early Black American experiences, the exhibition did prompt viewers to consider how early America's racial and social inequality persists today. As Lauren described, leveraging creativity and broadening our scope allowed us to, quote, make untold stories loud and those that continue to go untold even louder. Transhistorical interpretations helped flesh out this identity-focused exhibition, but reframing the collection required a different approach. The exhibition was a reinstallation project. My colleague Laura Sprague and I needed to engage with the permanent collection to address the history of early American and European art while bringing a critical lens to Bowdoin's collecting and interpretive history. The project was ambitious since we wanted to integrate seemingly unrelated themes into a cohesive exhibition that spanned 4 centuries. We immediately saw the utility of familiarizing ourselves with all facets of the collection. We explored nearly every section of collection storage to see what diverse, complex, and subverting narratives appeared or brought new stories and perspectives to light. This sifting process also allowed us to reckon with absence and presence and extend traditional representation beyond the figurative. Only after this initial review did we develop our interventionist approach. We wanted to make the reinstallation palpable for our audiences without sugarcoating history. As with all cultural institutions, there is a balancing act of accommodating various parties and their interests in exhibition development and content. This can undoubtedly challenge how curators reframe understandings of what early American art is or can be. And in retrospect, I understand that this resistance to change necessitates a creative response. My co-curator and I researched and developed new interpretations of familiar works and exposed overlooked histories. Our reinstallation also brought new works into the galleries, some of which had been long held in collection storage. The new visuals allowed us to pair familiar works with unfamiliar ones to ease audiences into new modes of thinking and questioning. In the process, I realized that the traditional canon and the well-known or beloved works in the collection allowed us to subvert audiences' expectations and reintroduce them to Bowdoin's collection. One example of this reintroduction is Robert Feek's portrait of Brigadier General Samuel Waldo, done in 1748. As my co-curator Laura Sprague describes, this painting is considered one of the finest portraits in British America and commemorates Waldo's military status and accomplishments. As she interrogated the archive, she discovered that Waldo engaged in slave trading activities, alongside land speculation, which disrupted Wabanaki land sovereignty. This information was published as early as 1930, but had never been acknowledged in the museum's interpretation. Perhaps it was ignored or intentionally buried. Laura's interpretation then balanced the art historical significance of Robert Feek with the seemingly invisible histories that the patron embodied. Reintroduction and subversion also happened elsewhere in the exhibition. My interpretations of several 19th century landscape paintings acknowledge artistic contributions, but primarily revealed issues of settler colonialism and displacement. Our descriptions of gleaming silver objects encased in the center of the gallery highlighted the labor extraction and enslavement that made these objects and the products they contained possible. While these examples demonstrate how one might reveal Blackness in early American art, one must still reckon with the absences. Existing permanent collections reflect our incomplete records of Black communities due to archival erasure and systemic processes of unnaming, dismissing, and disremembering. A significant challenge for curators excavating these histories is the tendency, or perhaps desire, to overstate information for the sake of resolution. It is understandable that curators want to provide clarity and certainty about the narratives and works we share with the public. However, my preferred strategy is to acknowledge what is unknown. This strategy can be unsettling for audiences or even curators and challenge exhibition display strategies. Still, there is value in sitting with that discomfort of the unknowable and highlighting the social and racial conditions that engendered these archival silences. While developing the Reframing the Collection exhibition, the BCMA acquired a jar produced in circa 1840s at the Stony Bluff Manufactory in Edgefield County, South Carolina. The immediate question for everyone was whether David Drake or Dave the Potter created this vessel. I'll admit it would be great to share David Drake's story in the reinstallation, and his name would likely register to early American art enthusiasts. But my greatest concern was that we did not know if David Drake formed this jar. After close inspection, no signatures attributed the jar's maker to David Drake. So I recommended that the attribution list the manufacturer to represent better this jar's history and the unidentified people connected to it. The attribution ultimately listed the manufacturer and a possible maker attribution for David Drake. In retrospect, if I could, I would list the maker as an unidentified Edgefield Potter, since David Drake's association was based only on the creation date's alignment with the period in which Lewis Miles enslaved him. It would certainly be more accessible for audiences to digest a recognizable name instead of an unknown entity or entities. A single name would also fit the short space designated for a wall label's tombstone information. In this case, I do not believe the easy way helps us share the totality of Black experiences in early America. By not overstating the maker when no signatures exist to support the claim, our approach revealed a fuller history of Edgefield manufactories, the unnamed enslaved potters, and the exchange of Black bodies between these potteries. The topics hold merit and are worth sharing with the public, even without David Drake's name attached to this jar. Black presence in early American art collections would or could be more visible through collaboration with descendant communities. Traditional naming conventions and museum interpretation, archives, and metadata often privilege English language descriptors or Anglo-American references. Descendant communities can provide cultural insights, terminology, and nuance that curators and scholars may need, possess, or access. My colleague Laura modeled this approach during Reframing's most recent reinstallation. The object in question was a Wabanaki basket associated with Bowdoin College since 1834. Recently, she engaged with historians and Wabanaki cultural leaders to determine the correct maker and tribal attributions for the basket. Working with Passamaquoddy language keeper Dwayne Toma, he recommended an adjusted title, Posnut, instead of the previous description of box. Again, this naming or renaming requires collaboration with those who hold this knowledge and a willingness to incorporate community insight into one's scholarship. As both exhibitions demonstrate, critical intervention starts with collaboration and truly knowing your collection. This foundation is necessary when determining how your curatorial practice will intervene in the permanent collection and make space for Black and Brown histories in the galleries. Transhistorical approaches can help when a museum's collection has few early American works. But reviewing your collection regularly for institutions with substantial early American art holdings, you can ask what stories are invisible but can be excavated using a different perspective. Engage with the absences present in your collection by assessing your attributions, titling conventions, and seeking outside counsel. Naming, renaming, and reckoning are ongoing processes, and we should always be learning from ourselves, from others, acknowledging our missteps and correcting them in our practice. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful start to our discussion. And I'd now like to invite our next speaker, Janine Yaramoto-Bolt, to share their screen.
All right, thank you, Annie. And I just want to start by thanking the organizers of this symposium, especially Mathilde and the curators of the Unnamed Figures exhibition for inviting me to participate in today's discussion, and for Richard, who's working behind the scenes to make this event possible. As I understand it, I was invited to speak today because of my recent scholarship, which intersects with the Unnamed Figures exhibition, and my current role as a curator in which I attempt to translate my research methods into museum practice. In my research on colonial American portraiture, I have attempted to foreground perspectives and stories that have been overlooked in favor of settler colonial narratives and priorities. For example, previous scholarship on colonial portraiture has often focused on the status of the wealthy sitters, their conspicuous consumption, and the genealogical function of portraits. As we are all probably too aware, the subjects of colonial portraits are nearly all white. My work joins other recent scholarship, including the work of Jennifer Van Horn and Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw, who we heard from earlier, and asking how early American portraits, such as this one of Lucy Park Bird with an attendant from Virginia, were inherently shaped by slavery, race, and cross-cultural encounters and relationships. And much like the curators of the Unnamed Figures exhibition, I have long been interested in interrogating absence. Why have enslaved figures been rendered mostly invisible or marginal? And how have enslaved people shaped early artistic practices, even when they are invisible from the canvases? When enslaved people are visible, I ask how they function within the portrait. How do they disrupt the hierarchical relationships pictured? And some of the other research questions I ask include, who were the audiences for this painting, both intended and unintended? And how might these different audiences, including the enslaved community on a plantation where this particular portrait has hung since it was commissioned, interpret or interact with these artworks? As a curator, I have tried to approach the Chazen Museum of Art's collection with similar questions and research methods. I research how artworks in the collection relate to slavery and oppression, aware that telling these stories are important. However, there are many challenges in curatorial work that aren't necessarily an issue in publishing, including limited funding, being limited to objects within the collection or that can be acquired or borrowed, and the fact that museums privilege objects. It can be difficult to discuss the absence of certain people or narratives when there is not a representative object within the collection. And there's also often concern about how to display problematic artworks in a way that both respects viewers while being transparent about history. Finally, the Chazen is part of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which means we are a teaching museum. Now, this isn't a challenge so much as a consideration and an opportunity. While we do serve the larger Madison public, the university and its students and faculty are principal audiences. Last year, the Chazen Museum of Art embarked on a permanent collection reinstallation project. Leading up to 2023, the curators completed an assessment of the collection, identifying areas of strength and weaknesses, and areas where we can make very strategic new acquisitions to augment the current collection. Over the last 6 months or so, the curators have been brainstorming and drafting proposals for galleries and engaging in discussions with other staff and community members about labels and designs. And to give you some brief background about this project, I feel like I should tell you all that our director started in late 2017. Our chief curator started in 2019. And while plans for reinstallation were delayed by COVID, I started as Associate Curator of American Art in 2021, and other curators are similarly newer to the museum. And so therefore, this reinstallation is truly an opportunity to completely rethink the museum's collections, the galleries, and our approach to interpretation, as the entire curatorial team and much of the other staff is actually much newer to the museum. So one of the greatest challenges for telling inclusive stories in the galleries is the permanent collection's relative lack of diversity in the non-contemporary collection. And I know that this is a challenge that many museums face, and as Elizabeth has already pointed out. We do have a collection of African art and Asian art, though they are much smaller than our collections of European and American art. And notably, our European and American art collections lack examples of historic artwork by non-white artists. Recent gifts of artworks by the artist Carl G. Hill actually represent the earliest oil paintings in the collection by an African American artist, and they date to the 1930s. While we do have some works on paper, the issue with works on paper is that these are very light sensitive, and so they have to be rotated in the galleries, limiting how many could actually be on display in the permanent collection. And while one obvious solution is to simply acquire artworks by more non-white artists, it's not really that simple. As many of you are already aware, these artworks are in very high demand by institutions and private collectors right now, and they're also relatively rare. Therefore, they tend to be very expensive and beyond what we can reasonably afford. And I think recent records being set by Pottery by Dave Drake is an excellent example, not only of the prices for some of these artworks, but also the ethical considerations over who gets to profit from these sales. Over the long term, we certainly hope to acquire more artworks to actually diversify the objects in our collection. But for now, we must think about prioritizing ways to tell inclusive stories, represent diverse perspectives, and interpret racist histories with the collection that we already have. The biggest experiment at the Chazen has been the Remancipation Project. The Remancipation Project kicked off in 2021. It has been a partnership between the Chazen and Mask Consortium, a collective of creatives who are interested in partnering with art institutions to interpret problematic works of art and use technology to make art more accessible. The most recognizable member of Mask is Sanford Biggers, the contemporary conceptual artist. Members of Mask first visited the Chazen in 2019 when there was an exhibition of Biggers' artwork. They encountered this sculpture in the gallery, the Emancipation Group by the white American artist Thomas Ball, dating to 1873. Ball began the composition in the wake of President Lincoln's assassination. Ball's sculpture represents Lincoln magically breaking the chains of bondage, while a mostly nude freedman crouches on the ground at his feet. He is not an individual, but a type meant to represent all formerly enslaved people. As other art historians and critics have also noted, this sculpture characterizes Black freedom as an act of white power given to a figure who remains on the ground, unable to free himself. It affirms an unequal relationship between Black and white Americans, even as it celebrates emancipation. A larger revised version of the Emancipation Group actually became the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C. in 1876, followed by another monument in Boston. And in 2020, the city of Boston actually removed their monument from public view in response to a public petition and in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests. Since entering the Chazen's collection in 1976, the Emancipation Group had actually been on view with no interpretive label until 2021. The sculpture was moved occasionally, though it was always displayed near European and American artworks, mostly from the 19th century, including landscapes and still lifes, as you can see in these photographs. Installed in this way, especially without labels, the sculpture uncritically reinforced the historical narratives in American art celebrating imperialism and abundance. In 2019, it was in a gallery featuring mostly portraits of white Americans and British subjects, similar to the installation shown here in 2021. And this is similar to how Biggers and Mask saw the sculpture for the first time. They were struck by the sensation of being watched by the white portrait subjects lining the walls. They were also hyper-aware that the only other person of color represented in the room was a mostly nude, unnamed Black person shown on his knees. Following the 2020 murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests that brought renewed criticisms to museums and monuments, Mask reached out to the Chazen. The Chazen staff was already having discussions about what to do with the Emancipation Group and how to address problematic histories and contemporary social justice issues with the collection. So long story short, the Remancipation Project was born. Over the next 2 years, the Chazen team collaborated very closely with Mask. They visited the museum and explored the collection, making 3D scans of pieces that interested them from across the collections. Mask and the Chazen invited creatives and community members to visit the Chazen and perform or create responses to the Emancipation Group in the gallery itself. There was an interpretive dance, drum circle performance, poetry, improvisational music, and all kinds of other responses. All of these responses were filmed. We allowed as much freedom to perform in the space as we could. Sanford Biggers also created a response sculpture, seen here, in which the Chazen has acquired for the permanent collection. I did research on the Emancipation Group and the various versions that Thomas Ball produced to share all this information with our collaborators. There were also many conversations throughout the long project about how the sculpture made people feel. Many of our mask collaborators spoke about how uncomfortable it made them, how unwelcome they typically felt in museums, and how cathartic it was to actually be able to perform and be invited into the museum galleries. Suddenly, this room that had felt suffocating in its whiteness became a place of creativity and catharsis. Together, we co-curated an exhibition that featured these responses, along with a gallery intervention and historical research. Mask collaborators reviewed the text that we wrote and vice versa, ensuring that there was lots of opportunity to give feedback on language and interpretation. We made conscious decisions around language, right? For example, on the timeline we produced that gave sort of an abbreviated history of slavery, we used the term MAFA instead of the transatlantic slave trade as a section heading. MAFA is a Kiswahili word meaning great disaster or great tragedy and denotes the period of the transatlantic slave trade. This is a preferred term used by some scholars of African and African diasporic studies. And I must admit, this is not a term that I was very familiar with, but it was suggested by Mask, and it made sense to use it to foreground the people most affected by the trade. We also were conscious of using terms like self-liberated or self-emancipated instead of fugitive, and of course, enslaved person instead of slave. For the exhibition, I looked for artworks in the Chazen collection that related to the Civil War, emancipation, the Jim Crow era, and that represented African Americans to use as supporting objects to put the Emancipation Group in context. However, there were very few historic objects in the Chazen's American collection that really met this criteria. One artwork that I did find in the collection was this print by the 19th century artist Edwin Forbes called Coming Into the Lines. Forbes traveled with the Union Army producing illustrations for magazines. This particular image represents self-emancipated Americans approaching the Union Army looking for refuge. The print is unaccessioned and was found in the collection, meaning that we do not actually know how it came to be in the Chazen's possession. It is not officially in the collection, though it is technically in our care. As you can see, it's in rough condition with a lot of staining, and normally we would not exhibit a work on paper like this. However, Mask was very interested in displaying it since the content related directly to the Emancipation Group. And we agreed to exhibit it, and we wrote a label being very transparent about its status as an unaccessioned artwork. And we also admitted in our label the lack of representation within our collection. One of the most popular attractions of the exhibition was the section on iconography. In this area, we included 3D printed elements taken from the Emancipation Group in a display. Lines led outwards to interpretive texts and objects that explained and provided context for the symbols in the Emancipation Group. Putting the Emancipation Group on a lower platform and installing other artworks like this encouraged visitors to look closely and move around the object. While most of the objects were from our collection, we also made some strategic loans in this section since, as I already mentioned, we had very few objects in our collection that related to the work. For example, we borrowed the now iconic Wedgwood medallion featuring the kneeling enslaved figure asking, "Am I not a man and a brother?" from the Chipstone Foundation. And this allowed us to put the kneeling freedman's pose in context and show visual precedent for it. And we included this contemporary French print featuring a white man struggling against chains. We wanted to show a composition featuring a figure breaking his own chains as a counterpoint to the passivity in Ball's composition. Showing these artworks together can help visitors understand, if they didn't already, why so many viewers take issue with Ball's freedman who seems to lack agency. The exhibition also staged a gallery intervention. We partially reinstalled the permanent collection gallery featuring some of the portraits that had been displayed around Emancipation Group, which you see on the right side of the screen. The labels emphasized the connections that individual sitters and artists had to slavery or dispossession. For example, Lady Caroline Montagu's father was the governor of Jamaica. Henry Rayburn, the artist of this portrait, was involved in his family's trading company that did business in the West Indies, and thus he benefited from enslaved labor. The subject, Colonel Fraser, actually owned cotton plantations in South America along with his sons. In the case of this portrait of William Byrd Powell, the composition actually directly related to the subject's problematic activities and beliefs. Many visitors to the museum remark on the subject's very large forehead and actually find his representation quite comical. Powell, however, was a phrenologist. Phrenologists incorrectly believed that the size and shape of human crania indicated one's character and intellectual abilities. In the mid-19th century, phrenologists developed racist theories about human difference based on the study of Black and Indigenous peoples. Powell actually argued that it was experience and education and not genetic inheritance, as some argued, that shaped a person's crania. However, he plundered about 200 skulls from sacred Choctaw, Creek, Alabama, Yuchi, Hitchati, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Attakapas, I'm sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing that, and Natchez burial sites, which he used as evidence in his research. And in many cases, access to these burial grounds was possible because of forced Indian removal in the Southeast. Powell's reputation as a phrenologist may explain the attention to his forehead in this portrait, and the artist probably exaggerated its prominence and thus his alleged intelligence. Visitors who now read the label can learn that the elements of the painting that they may find humorous are actually rather insidious. In the Remancipation exhibition, then on the opposite wall, on the left side of your screen, Mask staged a gallery intervention. Directly opposing the portrait of Lady Montagu is a borrowed portrait of the contemporary artist Carrie Mae Weems by Kehinde Wiley. This portrait echoed the composition and grand manner style of the historic portrait. On the left are reimagined oaklades or rizas inspired by the Russian icons in the Chazen collection, featuring civil rights activists and notable people of color from Wisconsin's history. The text also extends the history of slavery seen in the earlier section of the exhibition to connect to contemporary civil rights issues. The other flanking wall featured photographic portraits of the artists and activists who responded to Emancipation Group as part of the project. Their responses were filmed and projected on the final wall of the exhibition, which you can sort of make out on the back. This section blended the historic material in the collection with contemporary responses to artwork and racism in society. While including contemporary artwork as a response to historic visual culture has become a fairly common method of diversifying galleries and museums, the Chazen staff was also aware of the need to not rely on artists of color to do most of the labor involved with reinterpretation. This exhibition allowed us to blend our research and curatorial skills and knowledge of the collection with their creative responses. We also wanted to do more than a single gallery intervention. We wanted to make sure that our approach was not just temporary and that lessons from this exhibition could live on in the permanent collection. Therefore, the Chazen has decided to take an object-centered approach to our permanent galleries for our reinstallation. This is largely inspired by the success of the Remancipation Project and its intense focus on one individual object. It also allows us to turn some of our weaknesses into strengths. We are an encyclopedic museum, but we do not have a lot of depth in many areas of the collection. Choosing an artwork to focus on in each gallery allows us to do a deep dive into one piece, much like we did with the Emancipation Group. We hope to teach visitors how to do object-based interpretation and are leaning into our role as a teaching museum. This approach will also hopefully help break down some of the Western hierarchies of art history. For example, we will not have a European gallery or an African gallery, siloed in separate corners, and so forth. Taking this approach will allow us to make cross-geographic and cross-temporal connections from our collection. It will allow us to diversify our galleries by bringing together artworks from different cultures and time periods that share similar themes or reference similar materials when it feels appropriate. For example, we have proposed this painting of the village of Olinda by Franz Post as a potential focus object for a gallery. We can use additional artworks from the collection to really break down the iconography and the histories embedded within this painting. For instance, an African drum in our collection, which relates to the figures of enslaved Africans playing musical instruments and dancing. A sugar bowl and teapot to broaden the discussion of the relationship between slavery, sugar, and refinement that relates directly to the sugar processing buildings that appear in the back of the Post painting. Perhaps a Haitian landscape to discuss the African diaspora and continued history of plantations. And a contemporary artwork that engages with the history of collecting exotica and plants, which relates to the detailed depiction of flora and fauna in the foreground of this painting. And these are just some of these early ideas that we have been proposing and discussing. Our reinstallation is also an opportunity to really rethink didactic texts. For example, we're in the process of deciding what information to include on our tombstones on each label. The part of the label content that simply identifies, and really not so simply, right, identifies artist, title, date, etc. We are considering how to identify an unknown artist, especially when the artwork comes from a marginalized or colonized community where the loss of an artist's identity is related directly to colonial practice. And we are considering the best way to identify where an artwork was made, considering the long histories of nation-state building and colonization all around the world. The reinstallation will thus be an opportunity, we hope, for visitors to truly re-encounter the Chazen's permanent collection and revisit and rethink some of these popular paintings, and some of which have been in storage for a very long time. The curatorial team is still in this early stages of planning for the permanent collection reinstallation, but we look forward to the conversations that it hopefully will inspire. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for Janine. And I now invite our final presenter, Michael Hartman, to share his screen.
Thank you so much, Anne. Just give me one moment here. Technology, you know. Okay. So, let's see. Are you seeing?
Yes, we're seeing presenter view, so you might want to exit.
1 second.
Oh,
Better?
now this is good.
Perfect. Okay. Before I begin, I want to thank my fellow speakers, Gwendolyn, Jen, Janine, Elizabeth, and Anne for taking the time to share your time, talents, and experiences with us today. I also want to offer my thanks to Matilda and Richard for running this event behind the scenes, and want to congratulate the co-curators of Unnamed Figures for mounting the exhibition that has brought us all together this afternoon. Today, I will focus on the challenges and possibilities of incorporating Black artists, perspectives, and voices into permanent collection reinstallations at the Hood Museum of Art. But before I get to that, though, I want to acknowledge that the Hood Museum of Art occupies the lands and waters of the Abenaki peoples and was built without permission from the Abenaki Nation. This institution also has benefited from the economies of slavery and the labor of African-descended captives. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place and the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched New England. Furthermore, it provides a crucial foundation for building respectful relationships with all of those who call these lands home today and into the future. The Hood Museum of Art's Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Indigenous Art, Jamie Powell, who is a citizen of the Osage Nation, encourages our curatorial team to think beyond simply reading land and labor acknowledgements and to hold ourselves accountable, spurring us to implement decolonial and anti-racist practices in our everyday work. In my own curatorial practice, this means that I do not take an additive approach to exhibition installation, like many of the folks who just presented. I don't merely insert artworks by Black, Indigenous, and other artists of color into pre-existing installations because the art historical and museological frameworks that we have inherited are rooted in colonial ideologies and policies that were created to explicitly exclude these individuals. Instead, my curated and co-curated permanent collection installations embrace thematic approaches that incorporate ideas and topics that are more fully inclusive of the diversity of artists represented specifically within the Hood Museum's American collections. So for instance, in the recent installation on the right, it made sense to pair Valerie Hegarty's 2007 piece, George Washington on a Stick, with an unfinished study for Loitz's Washington Crossing the Delaware, a Jose Clemente Orozco graphite study of George Washington that later became the female school teacher in his Epic of American Civilization mural here at Dartmouth, and a Florida Seminole shoulder bag. Together, these works invited visitors to think about the legacy of George Washington, as well as nationhood and nation building within Indigenous communities. Or, as in the photograph at the left, where we placed Ho-Chunk artist Truman Lowe's wing above a painting of Lake Superior by Canadian artist Lauren Harris. Both artists represent the same landscape, but do so within their own artistic traditions. Framed on the left by two prints from the Dominican York Proyecto Gráfica Portfolio Manifestaciones, and on the right by a print by African-American artist Walter Williams. These artworks all spoke to the powerful intersection of identity and placemaking in relationship to our local environment. In both installations, artwork spanned media, time periods, nations, and cultures. One focused on reimagining history and nationhood, and the other considering placemaking in relationship to the natural world. I introduced these past exhibitions to help contextualize the broader work curators at the Hood Museum have been doing to expand presentations of American art to be more inclusive and expansive. The rest of my talk today will focus on a current exhibition at the Hood Museum called Liquidity, Art, Commodities, and Water, which plays on the dual definition of liquidity as liquid assets that are bought and sold, and quite literally as liquid substances, to consider histories of global trade across water, linkages between water and tourism, the use of water and other liquids as artistic materials, historic water pollution, and the importance of protecting access to clean water. As such, the exhibition I'm discussing does not solely feature Black artists or even actually include historical representations of Black people, but takes strides to be more inclusive of historical entanglements between individuals and their communities. As I walk you through this exhibition, I will speak more about how I have reinterpreted artworks in the collection, the importance of curators having the time and resources to research their permanent collections, and how new acquisitions can bolster a museum's ability to be more representative of the histories and artistic contributions of African Americans. I will also speak to the need to balance histories of slavery and oppression seen in many such installations of historical art with representations of or relating to Black joy. Liquidity can be approached from two directions. Visitors might encounter Daniel Minter's A Distant Holla at the far left, a contemporary work that visually signals the importance of home, water, and diaspora among African Americans in the United States. Moving to the right from Minter's piece, a case holds works by Inuit and Yupik artists, which surround a ceramic cage by contemporary Shinnecock artist Courtney Leonard, intended to draw the viewer's attention to the impacts of the commercial fishing industry and its impact on Leonard's community. Furthest right, a double hang of two mid-19th century fish paintings by white artist James Henry Cafferty complete the space. Together, the diversity of these artworks and artists helps visitors find an entry point into the exhibition through an artwork they might find more familiar or relatable, while also introducing the watery themes they will encounter throughout the galleries. From the other direction, as seen in the photograph on the left, a jar by David Drake greets visitors alongside a painting of a mermaid by Elihu Vedder, and a case with artworks by Inuit, Modoc, and Tahltan artists, as well as a salt dish in the shape of a boat from the Boston Glassworks. It is crucial here that Native American art is not only present within our American galleries, but fully incorporated into the broader program. Native art is not off to the side in a case all on its own, not treated as an afterthought, but placed alongside and in dialogue with works by non-Native artists by sharing the same space and by sharing, in this instance, the same case. This approach likewise extends to works by Black artists in the exhibition. The label for the David Drake jug emphasizes the material form of this pot and its movement through time and space. The small opening suggests that it stored liquids and was stopped with a cork. It was made from wet clay and fired to remove all traces of water to become a vessel for holding the liquid, and then traded as a commodity bought and sold, filled and refilled by other enslaved individuals who read Drake's name or lines of poetry and shared their literacy within networks outside the domain of their enslavers. This interpretation presents Drake's work as integral to the overall thematic concept and organization of the exhibition, rather than something merely added to a 19th century gallery to increase representation of Black artists. Drake's pottery has finally started to receive widespread study and acclaim outside of Southern decorative art circles where he has been discussed for several decades. But if museums are to be dedicated to expanding their stories, they must also come to terms with the fact that David Drake was one of thousands of enslaved artists. His works can fit within multiple art historical and historical narratives, but he also cannot become the sole stand-in for enslaved artists, as Elizabeth noted in her talk. Many museum curators are also not aware of enslaved artists within their institutional collections who might have contributed to an artwork's creation, because few curators have the time to fully research their collections because so many museums rely upon temporary traveling exhibitions to expand narratives for them. I have been fortunate, though, to have some time to research the Hood's permanent collection to better understand these histories. My current intern, Dartmouth student Madison Bukalski, has been invaluable in researching 18th century Massachusetts silversmiths who relied upon and benefited from the labor and talents of enslaved people. Madison's research is inspired by the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, a project managed by Dr. Tiffany Moman and Dr. Torrin Gatson that embraces a primary research-oriented approach to enhance what we know about the contributions of free and enslaved Black craftspeople. And Dr. Moman, of course, will be speaking in the second half of the symposium on March 8th. But in this example, Madison has been attempting to trace an enslaved man named Caesar through various branches of the family, as he likely worked as an enslaved silversmith for Samuel Edwards, his father John, and his brother Thomas. Installing a Spanish colonial breastplate above these sauce boats introduces silver as a liquid asset that can be melted down and reformed, but also used as currency. The label explains the breastplate's iconography, but also points to enslaved Black and Indigenous people who mined silver in South America, which was then shaped into these objects by craftspeople, Black, white, free, and enslaved. Ending with Edwards' shop, the label recognizes the often unnamed individuals who contributed to the creation of such objects and how enslavers benefited from their stolen labor. And while these histories might be familiar to scholars on this call, many museum goers are often unaware of these histories, and it's critically important that we kind of bring them into our gallery spaces. Histories of slavery need space within historical American galleries because enslaved people contributed directly to the creation of many of these artworks. However, I also believe that discussions of slavery and oppression must be balanced or outshone by positive representations of Black experience and resilience. So next to the silver case, two mid-20th century calabashes painted by Haitian artist and voodoo priest André Pierre are presented alongside a traverse board, a type of navigational tool used on ships to track distance traveled. Within Haitian voodoo, Pierre's lavishly dressed Frida is associated with love, beauty, and luxury, and hails from the Ertzuli, a family of Loa or Iwa voodoo spirits associated specifically with water, fluidity, and femininity. She is married to Agu, who is dressed in a sailor's uniform on the other calabash. He stands in the sea next to his ship inscribed Imamu, which ferries the dead to the afterlife. These images celebrate African-descended people's perseverance and adaptation within diaspora. And such stories of resilience continue in a rather unexpected place. On the wall opposite these works, through a portrait sketch of Daniel Webster, Dartmouth class of 1802 by Gilbert Stuart, which hangs above Daniel Webster's tea set. Elsewhere in the exhibition, labels discuss the importance of tea in 18th and 19th century contexts and the emergence of special vessels for making and drinking tea. With Webster's tea set, I first draw attention to the racist portrayal of unclothed figures, presumably Native Americans with fruits and flowers, which echo the persistent and reductive stereotype of Native Americans being close to nature, before connecting the tea set to Webster's own biography. I continue to describe how Webster, a Massachusetts senator and later Secretary of State, purchased this set in the late 1840s, and in March 1847, also purchased an enslaved man named Paul Jennings. This purchase was made in conversation with Jennings, who received his freedom after working for Webster to repay the debt. Jennings likely served tea from this set because Webster later recommended him to another employer as, quote, a very honest and competent dining room servant. Jennings, born in Virginia and previously enslaved by President James Madison, actually wrote the first White House memoir in 1865, thus demonstrating a remarkable story of resilience. I only realized this connection between Jennings and Webster when undertaking dissertation research at James Madison's Montpelier in March 2022 during a month away from the museum. I mentioned this to emphasize that museum curators rarely have opportunities to step away from their jobs to undertake long-term research, which is a real detriment to our field. Jennings' story as an enslaved man who secured his freedom and published his experiences can be told through these documents that I've shown you and through this tea set. When teaching Dartmouth students, I bring copies of these documents to the gallery to help them understand the importance of primary source research for expanding the narratives that we can tell about the past. In the portrait of Daniel Webster by Gilbert Stuart, these themes continue and build upon recent work by Jennifer Van Horn to discuss the story of Neptune Thurston, who was mentioned earlier this morning. The label informs readers that Neptune Thurston, a man enslaved as a cooper in Newport, Rhode Island, first taught Gilbert Stuart how to paint. Thurston drew faces onto the lids of barrels filled with molasses, flour, alcohol, or other commodities, which were shipped across the Atlantic throughout Britain's North American and Caribbean colonies. Because Thurston's artworks were likely encountered by other enslaved people who loaded, unloaded, and opened these barrels filled with commodities, his art was not necessarily intended for white audiences. Stuart's sketch of Daniel Webster is similar in shape to Thurston's portraits, sketched on circular barrel lids. My label concludes with a question that reads, does the shape and sketchiness of this painting help us imagine how Neptune Thurston's barrel paintings inspired a young Gilbert Stuart, the artist best known for his iconic portraits of George Washington? By ending with a question, I hope to inspire visitors to think more deeply and more expansively about Thurston's role as an artist equally worthy of our recognition. While giving tours, I also invite viewers to contemplate the story of Thurston's faces drawn on barrel lids to Drake's poetry. Both barrels and jugs were shipped as commodities and encountered by a variety of individuals, both free and enslaved. Thus far, my discussion of this exhibition has emphasized the possibilities of archival research within a museum's permanent collections to incorporate Black artists and Black historical figures, purposefully omitted from art and history due to the white supremacist origins of these disciplines. But now, I would like to turn my attention to another gallery in the exhibition that looks at water pollution, both past and present, as well as the different ways in which artists represent water. Historical images of polluted waterways on the back wall are anchored at the center with a large painting by Cherokee Creek and Osage artist Yadika Star Fields, titled White Buffalo Calf Woman March. In this work, Fields interprets a moment from the fight against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, a project that threatened both Lakota sovereignty and access to clean water. Women march across the central portion of the canvas, and a feeling of hope is found in the liminal space of the highway and the vastness of the sky. This painting honors the labor of women-led movements at Standing Rock, together with Lakota oral history of the White Buffalo Calf Woman, a figure of solidarity, fluidity, and hope within Lakota and related communities. Using this work as a contemporary touchstone familiar to many of our visitors and students helps them understand how the surrounding artworks are also related to historical conversations around access to clean water. This work by white artist Lemuel Eldred, which is to the right of Fields' painting, has been in storage since it was donated to the museum in 1990. It finally found its place within this installation due to the thematic approach. Eldred painted the scene from a place not far from the museum called Lead Mine Bridge. With Mount Madison rising in the background, the scene's natural beauty obscured the region's pollutive mining industry. Eldred does not paint the mining shaft sunk into the bed of a nearby brook, nor does the painting fully illustrate complaints from nearby residents that the water was stagnant, milky, very offensive, and could generate fevers. However, many trees fail to thrive, their lack of leaves suggesting the industry's devastation. To the left of Fields' painting, two works are double stacked. The bottom is an industrial scene by William Lewis Sonntag that upends our expectations of 19th century American landscapes, highlighting the environmental impact of rapid industrialization. Man-made factories and smokestacks looming above New York's waterways replace the mountains and lakes of the natural world that were expected of landscape painting in the 1870s. Above the Sonntag is a painting by James Bolivar Needham, painted at the turn of the 20th century. Heavily layered and quickly applied paint suggests that Needham painted this Chicago River scene from life, as does the painting's small size at just 12 by 8 inches. On the reverse, Needham inscribed the date, September 3rd, 1898. On this day, weather forecasters reported that temperatures were topping 92 degrees. The heat suggests why Needham sought respite away from one of Chicago's notoriously smelly and polluted waterways. Notably, Needham was one of the earliest known Black artists working in Chicago. He exhibited throughout the 1890s, and reporters lauded his ability to find beauty quote, in the mud of Chicago's rivers. Amid increasing industrialization at the end of the 19th century, Needham embraced an impressionistic style that he experienced firsthand when decorating buildings and visiting the 1893 Chicago's World Fair and studying under the white artist Loreto Taft. This is one of the first artworks that I acquired for the museum after being hired, and I really love that this piece was likely painted outside from life. To me, it really suggests the joy of painting, something rarely discussed within the context of Black landscape painters in the 19th century. Art historians have been quick to look at landscapes by better-known artists like Robert Duncanson and read Black identity, and specifically narratives of trauma, into his paintings, a trend that is well documented by Kirsten Pye Buick. The Hood Museum owns a work by Duncanson, and while it portrays a waterway, the piece did not fit within the overall theme of this wall and drawing attention to historic water pollution. I therefore left it out of the exhibition, a decision that serves as a reminder that inclusivity cannot be forced without the risk of tokenizing artists. Needham is one of many understudied and underappreciated Black artists from the 19th century. And as long as museums seek out works by Black artists like Duncanson, Charles Ethan Porter, and Edward Mitchell Bannister and insert them into collections without actually thinking about their larger careers, experiences, and impacts on the art world and their relationship to other artists and artworks, then the treatment of these artists remains secondary to the prevailing colonial narratives that have for so long excluded these individuals. This returns me to where I began my talk by emphasizing the opportunities of thematic installations. Organizing permanent collections around broad themes is one method of many for rethinking the discipline and expanding it in new and exciting ways. These installations require more work. Audiences more familiar with museums and canonical art historical narratives might find it difficult when first encountering these types of installations, especially when they are installed in spaces reserved for permanent collections. But thematic approaches also liberate us from feeling the need to always have certain artworks on view. And indeed, you don't see our John Singleton Copley, Benjamin West, or Albert Bierstadt in this exhibition. Although a dissertation in progress by Megan Baker at the University of Delaware will produce exciting new research on Copley and West that will spur their inclusion into future installations focused on the roles and impacts of African Americans in the production of these artworks. The thematic approach provides an opportunity to exhibit artworks that have rarely, if ever, been put on display in the museum, as Elizabeth and Janine mentioned earlier, which can be augmented by strategic acquisitions, such as the painting by Needham that speaks to water pollution, expands our knowledge of American Impressionism, and emphasizes the joy of painting in 1890s Chicago. At the Hood Museum, the presentation of Black joy is an ongoing conversation between curators. Enslavement is discussed in liquidity, and within this exhibition, I have attempted to achieve some balance. More broadly, though, this balance is achieved across our broader exhibition program. Elisa Swindell, our curator of photography, has an exhibition on view right now called And I'm Feeling Good, Relaxation and Resistance, which celebrates joy in African-American life while focusing on the pleasures and challenges in achieving and maintaining that good feeling in the United States. Our former curatorial research associate, Alexandra Thomas, also has an exhibition on view called Homecoming, Domesticity and Kinship in Global African Art, which emphasizes the role of women in crafting African and African diasporic art histories by focusing on themes of home, kinship, motherhood, femininity, and intimacy. Ensuring that our overall museum experience provides a balance, and in this instance places greater emphasis on positive Black experiences past and present, is tantamount to what we do at the Hood Museum, how we operate and how we think about presenting our collections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'd like to invite our speakers to all rejoin us. And then Mathilde, we have some time for group discussion before we open it up to the larger Q&A, if I'm correct.
Yes, you have 30 to 40 minutes. Yes, you have a good time.
Terrific. So I'll get our conversation started and then we can open it up to the larger audience Q&A. But I want to start, I'll thank you all. These were all wonderful presentations and they give me so much to think about. One thing that struck me when I was listening to Janine's presentation as she's talking about the Re-Emancipation Project and the organization of new ideas around this Thomas Ball sculpture was the sort of conflict or dissonance between the static permanence of an object like a sculpture or like a monument and the more impermanent or intangible aspects of community and performance and creativity and dialogue. So to that end, I want to invite you all to sort of reflect upon, you all talk about interventions and collaboration and teamwork with your curatorial teams was a theme that was running throughout all of your presentations. But I'd like you to sort of speak about how you make those impermanent things, those intangible things that go beyond, that go on behind the scenes, visible to visitors and how they respond to that. I'm thinking, for example, also of Janine's label text that she describes, where she notes the Edwin Forms illustration, and they call out the fact that it has previously been in storage and it's not well cared for, but it's the only representation they have. So I'm also curious about how, as teaching museums, you navigate those didactic exercises. So any of you can start our conversation and we can sort of build from there. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think part of my process is thinking more about or removing myself from sort of traditional visual art and figuring out how to bring different forms of media, multimedia into the gallery space. And so even thinking about African/American, we really capitalized on not only the museum's permanent collections, but special collections as well. And so bringing text that brought the Black voice, that make that permanent and relevant to that show, but also incorporating archival footage of Gullah Geechee Black songs and bringing that into the gallery space as well, trying to tap into performance that has some permanence to it. I also think that sort of gallery tours and teaching in the classroom are a way of activating in a permanent way. It does happen in the span of like a 90-minute class session, of course, but I think you're able to exchange in a dialogue and have those moments sort of sit in the space of those students' minds and sort of see the ripple effect that those conversations can prompt.
We've been having a lot of conversations about the importance of transparency. I mean, transparency was one of the key principles of the Remancipation Project. And we for example, we recorded all of our Zoom meetings with the collaborators. And so just trying to be at the end, we had sort of the acknowledgements of everyone who worked in the exhibition, everyone who participated. We've made that material, all the filmed performances and things available online. And so it's open access. And then moving forward, we're talking a lot about how within the permanent collection, we might have labels that show how do you read a label? Who are the people making these choices that, these are curatorial decisions. So there's actually these aren't objective, right? Words we're putting on the wall and not objective facts, right? And then there's also a lot of discussion, particularly because we're at a university and the current political and cultural climate of including compiling sort of bibliographies for each gallery, right? That can be accessed. And we don't know yet exactly how we're going to do this. We know we are, but whether it's accessed via QR code, whether there's a printed version for people to see and then also access online, we'll figure this out. But actually including bibliography, right? So these are sort of the scholars whose work is informing our work, right? That this information didn't come out of nowhere, that a lot of research and effort went into this, this research. And so making that research transparent and visible to visitors, I think is part of what we're looking for in the future.
Yeah, Janine, I just want to pause for a second and sit with your comment about how wall labels aren't objective facts. And, I think a lot of what we're all sort of pushing against, or what the curators of this exhibition are pushing against, are that the sort of empiricism or the idea of the archive as being the only rendering or its truth, it's permanent, but in fact, it is someone's choice. So going back to also Elizabeth's example of the David Drake pot, you put David Drake on a wall label and then suddenly it's fact, when in fact it was someone's opinion. So Michael, were you going to jump into this conversation?
Oh yeah, I was just going to build on a few things that folks have said. So one thing that we do often in our introductory texts is essentially state what is not in this gallery, which was something that we started a few years ago, specifically with the exhibition This Land, American Engagement with the Natural World, where we included a sentence midway through the text that said, we can share a lot of stories, but certainly not all, like given the limitations of our collection. So we try to take that transparency into the gallery. And then to speak to Janine's point a little bit more, every single exhibition has the curator's name on the wall. And then throughout the space, if someone else wrote a label, that person's name is on the label. So for liquidity, for instance, my intern wrote some of the labels. So my former intern, Nathan, wrote some of the labels. So his name is actually on those to kind of break down that idea that the museum is this, neutral or all-encompassing voice. And I think that you really do see that as you move through some of our spaces.
Yeah, I do want to also, I think it's remarkable that you all work at university galleries, and this is something that Dr. Anna Marley from PAFA has called out in the chat, that you all are working to craft these new narratives, and so you're teaching institutions, you're trying to teach the next generation of students to be critical about this. And I think Dr. Marley brings up a really good point in the chat when she talks about resources and how, as Michael said, it's a privilege for a curator to have the resources and the time to step away from the museum. And I'm wondering, to that end, when we talk about universities being stretched or museum culture or university culture being changed, how you all feel university museums fit into this sort of new discourse that's happening in the curatorial world, or whether it's possible or whether resources are limited.
I'm happy to jump in and start that. So I think that, I wanted to bring those points up because I do think that they are super valid, that curators at a lot of museums just don't have the chance to do this sort of research if they're in an institution that's being driven by temporary exhibitions, right? So it is a privilege in many ways, at least at my museum, that we don't take a lot of large temporary exhibitions, right? And that kind of turns into an opportunity for us because we can do smaller 2 and 3 gallery shows that are up for a year and a half, 2 years, and then switch them for something else out of the permanent collection, right? Part of that is the privilege also of being at an Ivy League institution that has a lot of depth to the collection. And that's just not something that other university museums necessarily have. So I wanted to be kind of open and honest just about that fact, right? I think at the same time, though, I don't see a lot of civic museums doing this sort of work. And I do think that they could be, right? They are talking about reinstalling permanent collections, but it seems like, not in every instance, but in a lot of instances, it's the same sort of artworks, maybe with different labels, and in not a lot of things that are going to be unexpected, right? And you don't have to reinvent the entire narrative. You don't have to do something that's entirely thematic, but I think that there is more opportunity there with permanent collections that maybe is not being taken.
Yeah, I can chime in there. I know Michael mentioned not having enough resources to sort of step away and do or conduct that longer term research. But I think especially in certain university museums, you also have a staffing issue. A lot of small people are doing a lot of work. And so it's even thinking about how to designate a certain amount of time in your day or in your month to actually do and investigate your collection. I think in my case, I did have a little bit of creative flexibility, mostly because I'm, the scholar in my curatorial team that focuses specifically on early African American experiences. And so given that that's my specialty, I kind of was able to run with or make certain suggestions around what the scope of that exhibition would look like. And I'm so grateful to my collaborator, Laura, to have her as a partner in the reinstallation, because she brings this, great knowledge of early American art, and then sort of combining that to tell a fuller history. And so I think the creativity is certainly there. I think the sort of makeup of restrictions are a little different in a university museum, whereas, civic institutions, you are definitely beholden to the public and different types of donors. But then in a university setting, you have donors to the college and donors to the museum. You've got friends of the museum and different types of restricted bequests and gifts. And so those come with all different, more, not necessarily more complex, but just a different set of circumstances that you then have to navigate. And then also making sure that your exhibitions are not necessarily blockbusters, but that they have that teaching resonance too.
Yeah.
Everything Michael and Elizabeth said, I wholeheartedly agree with. And I also just will throw out there that we have a built-in network of colleagues at a university, right? We've had some great opportunity to collaborate. For example, a professor did a project out of, I think it's like the geology department, doing like some stone analysis on some of our Buddhist sculpture, right? We were able to hold a small workshop with scholars of India and South Asia around our Indian miniatures, because our curatorial staff isn't a specialist in that area. So I think there's also just this wonderful built-in network of colleagues, grad students, people on campus who can also, be part of that community. And so.
Yeah, Janine, I also want to bring up the point that you all sort of acknowledge collaboration and knowledge sharing and labor sharing. And I know you are all invested with the idea of museums being the sites of repair and restorative justice as far as possible. And I'm also mindful that two of our speakers are women of color here today. So I want to sort of ask you all, I'm sure you all deeply thought, because I know you all have, about the role of labor sharing and knowledge sharing and collaboration in this project of repair and restorative justice within the museum. That's part of your sort of activist position.
Janine, do you want to go, or I'm happy to start? Okay. Yes. So community and care and empathy are sort of the foundation of everything that I do. And so going into exhibition projects at my alma mater in Maine, which is predominantly white, and finding community on campus was very important to me. And so while I have the sort of scholarly expertise, I want to hear back from my community. Just because I'm part of a descendant community does not mean I hold all of the expertise and knowledge. And so it was very important and intentional to not only be, speaking with Black faculty who are well-versed in different interdisciplinary modes of thinking, but also connecting with students who hold so much information about the way that they interact with museums, what types of stories they want to see, how invisible they feel in the galleries. And so from those community conversations, that tends to drive the sort of interventionist or activist approaches that I take to my projects.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say, the Remancipation Project was not just collaborative, it was I think above and beyond what even most museums do, just in the sense of how we were literally co-curating and how we opened up our gallery space with very little limitation on what artists could do in there. I mean, some of the things, it was well, we have to conserve the artwork. So there was a few things that we just couldn't do, but for the most part, we tried to be as flexible as possible. And it took a lot of work on our prep team, who have to handle artwork to sort of arrange everything. But it was just so rewarding to have those conversations in that space and to allow people to feel like it was their museum and their artwork, not just things that, normally it's you can't touch, you have to be, should be quiet or you should move carefully. And so it's just nice to make it much more of a community space, right? Not just to look at art on the walls, but to really engage with it was really important. And at a university, it was wonderful because so many of the students are interested in social justice. And so they're drawn to projects like this and they want to be a part of it. And there's a moment during the exhibition where our project just felt so important. And then also we felt so small, which was that a University of Wisconsin student went viral for making really racist comments that she was captured on social media. And it inspired a very large protest. And naturally, many students, and especially, students of color, were very upset with how the university handled the situation. And so there was a march the same day we were scheduled to have a big unveiling of Sanford Bigger's new sculpture and a big event at the museum. And it made us feel so small. It's what can we actually do in these situations? But then also, it just shows how important that work is, and to become a space where those students can hopefully feel safe, right? And so I know we sort of join the sort of party, may allow this to be a space of healing at this moment of deep conflict. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I love that we got on this conversation. You all shared about your curatorial collaborations and your curatorial teams. Then the students are obviously a part of the team that contribute to the makeup of the exhibition. Michael, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So we have a curatorial team that I think works really well together. So like something that we've been doing for a while now is once every other week during lunch on Mondays, we read like something relevant to each person's field and then we just discuss it during lunch, right? So that's one way that we are all have like sort of getting a better understanding of where everyone is coming from, what's happening in different folks' field. And I think that's been really helpful for us to even just start to share ideas across our different specialties. And, we don't always we don't have a built-in system for collaborating with faculty or students. It's more of an informal sort of process based on the project. But most of our projects, we do present them to what is our museum club, essentially. So it's about 25 Dartmouth undergraduates who choose to be part of the museum. They put on an event once a term, right? So curators are presenting their ideas to them and kind of getting feedback from students in more of an informal way, like while they're eating pizza at like 5 o'clock on a Thursday, right? Rather than asking them to come in for like a big meeting. So that's been one way that we've really had success in kind of getting some student buy-in from students who are already invested in the institution, right? And then part of it is also making sure that we're doing enough outreach to get a broad swath of students across campus, but also having a greater diversity of students in that group. So
Yeah, I just have to say you all are so spoiled because my university museum at Penn State's currently closed, but so I haven't been to a university museum in a while, but we're supposed to reopen June 2024. I also, Michael, I want to pick up on something else you said. You were talking about Black joy, which is obviously so important to not just have the histories that we tell of Black persons be stories of violence and marginalization, but also joy. And but I'm struck by, you bring up the James Boulevard Needham, and of course he's working much later than, he's working after emancipation. And I was wondering, I want to ask you how you think about telling stories of Black joy, and this can also go to all of the panelists, when you don't have objects that support those narratives. So if we are working within or you guys, because I'm a professor and I can do whatever I want, but you guys are working in a system where you really have to privilege objects on display. So how do you tell stories of Black joy when the archive, as Sadiya Hartman has largely put it, is largely a tomb, that often Black persons and enslaved persons only jump into the archive as in a system of aberration or a system of violence or death. So how do you tell joy when you don't have objects that necessarily support that directly?
yeah, that's tough, right? So, one way that I think, I tried to do that was, for instance, through the story of Paul Jennings, right? As someone who had been enslaved by James Madison and then secures his own freedom through an arrangement that he kind of works out himself. And he's later involved in, he's very involved in Washington, D.C. abolitionist circles. He's involved with something called the Pearl Plot, which was an attempt to get 77 enslaved people, I think, out of D.C. on a boat. He probably also was forging papers for people enslaved in Virginia because he was literate. So like these are all things that we can bring into a broader conversation. And he certainly had a horrific life, right? But he is someone who is able to reach that point, become free, have his own family, write a book, and kind of set the record straight, because in his narrative, he kind of corrects things that the Madisons had said. Specifically, the Dolly Madison had rescued a portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart from the White House. And in his narrative, he's like, she absolutely did not do that. Here are the people who did that. Right. So I think that, that's one way, but that is a difficult example to get to, right? That takes a lot of time, again, to research and get there. And then with someone like Needham, that was an acquisition that we had to make. Although what I'll say on the other side of that is that no one has really ever written or said anything about James Bolivar Needham. He's not really in many books, if any, right? So then again, that is taking the time to do deep research into kind of what is out there on the market. And because no one has really researched him, this is the opposite problem of David Drake. That work was extremely affordable, like almost embarrassingly affordable, just because no one had taken the time to research him and write about him and kind of care about him and his story, right? So that's one way that museums, I think, going forward are going to bring artists like that into their collections and hopefully, that sort of public recognition will help kind of drive the field forward to be more expansive in the ways that you were talking about.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess I can jump in and just say, like, at the Chazen, because we have so few historical objects, like we have more stories of Black joy in our collection because a lot of what we do have is later, right? And so, but I agree with what Michael is saying, like one of the acquisitions I would love to make moving forward and is sort of shortlisted as a priority is we have so many like regionalist artworks, right? This white male masculine farmer. So we're going to be, telling some of those stories in the gallery. So I really want a work by a Midwestern artist who maybe someone like Needham, right? Who's working that area, who can help flesh out that story more, right? Of the Midwest and what's happening there. And then we have a recent group of works by the artist Carl G. Hill, who's affiliated with the Harlem Renaissance. He was a student of Augustus Savage at the Harlem Community Art Center. Nobody knows who he is. But his story is really important, and it allows us to get at some of these narratives with objects that we have and can actually get on the market. And they're just as important to tell, right?
Yeah.
And then hopefully by doing this object-based approach, like just with the one example I gave with the Franz Post, there are images of these enslaved African figures dancing, right? So even though that's a very contrived scene, we can support that with maybe other images or like that African drum and talk just about the survival of some of these cultural practices and sort of survival and resistance, not just the horrors of enslavement. And hopefully that will make sense.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll say it's interesting to hear about how to find or recover Black joy in early American art. I tend to take a different approach, thinking again of Sadia Hartman's Venus article. I tend to focus on Black reverence, if that makes any sense. I will say personally, I'm like a very empathetic person, and so I tend to feel the pain of those that existed before me. And so, if I'm seeing tiny impressions in a brick, for example, I'm seeing ghost shadows on the cabin of someone who was enslaved, I take the time to sort of commune with that experience. And so I think that is where I find a reckoning maybe in early American art, is trying to bring as much of that experience, those stories, to light in a way that is respectful and just very caring. And so thinking about one exhibition project, there is a thimble of Phoebe Ann Jacobs in Bowden's special collections. I presented that alongside this pamphlet that was documenting her life. But instead of focusing on the sort of mythological, very happy slave kind of narrative, I wanted to bring the presence of her into that space. And so I think that's where I want Blackness to sort of show up and not necessarily force a certain viewpoint on it if it does not exist. If it does exist, that's great. But I think there's definitely value in communing with what you have.
Yeah, to that end, Elizabeth, that has me recall what you were saying about if you could possibly reinterpret, if you still worked at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art and you could possibly reinterpret that one particular ceramic, you would say, unknown maker or one stone maker, because that person's life, while unrecorded, is still valid. And so by bringing that person into the gallery, we're giving them that level of like multidimensional care and just reverence, as you said, that trying to give a narrative one way or the other wouldn't necessarily allow for. This is such a generative conversation, but I don't necessarily want to monopolize. So Mathilde, can we start to bring in the audience Q&A? I think that would be wonderful.
Yes, I'm happy to bring it back. We have a question. We don't have many questions, so please do submit all your questions in the Q&A. I think I have a question because you answered some of them. And I think there is a question from Michael and the other scholars. What you say about the necessity for curators to have sufficient time to do the research required to be familiar with your collections and then use the existing works to create exciting new exhibition is so important. how do you carve out this time given the many other responsibilities you have in your role? So if you can talk about maybe sharing more strategies to find time to research, and if you would like to share these strategies with us, that would be amazing.
I can start. So yeah, I think that that's difficult, and I want to emphasize again that not everyone has that luxury, right? And I think it is in many ways on sort of chief curators and directors to prioritize that sort of work if we're going to really try and do things in a different way, right? So one thing that I do kind of in my own work, I'm able to essentially block off an entire day on my calendar, which makes my other days meetings, like meetings 8 to 5, right? And during that day, that's the day that I essentially undertake some sort of research, right? And it always is something, online. It might be researching the own collection, right? Like down in object files or something. But that's a policy that we have now instituted across the museum. It wasn't something that I just started, but we essentially keep an entire day where no one is in a meeting. So that, not only curators can have the time to do that sort of work, but so our educators can have times to, come up with exciting new programs, and our academic programming curators can come up with different ways that they want to teach with the collections, right? So that's one really small way, and it's really incremental, right? And then, I'm lucky to have an intern who works 10 hours a week, right? So that's one way that I can kind of direct research in one way. We don't have curatorial assistants at the museum that support us in a way like that. So our support is really coming from Dartmouth students who are also interested and engaged with these ideas, right? Yeah, and sometimes it also means that maybe something that used to be a priority is no longer a priority, right? I would, someone mentioned de-accessioning this morning, and there are works in this collection that I would love to get out of here, right? But where, it's where do I put my time, right? So maybe some of those days are spent on de-accessioning, but not a lot of them, right? So yeah, it's just difficult. It's difficult to figure out what your priorities are and how you're then going to make those priorities come to fruition. I'm hoping someone else says something that's a lot more meaningful than what I just said.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, so as curatorial assistant, right, you're supporting everyone else alongside your projects. And so my goal or my strategy was really to just be resourceful with my time, which sounds very vague. But essentially what I mean is, if I had a class visit or I'm presenting objects related to a certain class, I'd pick students' brains or facilitate the discussion in a way that helped me think through my strategies or the works I presented. I made it my mission to never be at my desk as much as possible when I was doing research. And so if I could visit collection storage or go into special collections or the library to do that primary and secondary research, that was my way of carving out that space to do my work while also not being, visible in the museum because my door was glass. And so it was very easy for people to pop in when they needed something. And so those were ways that I was able to carve out that time, even at sort of that curatorial assistant level.
And then I will just add that we as a curatorial team have collectively agreed we can be a lot more kind of cutthroat with gifts of art offers, right? Because a lot of curator time is taken up with just processing and researching new acquisitions and new offers. And so being able to say, we're going to take a step back and pause as much as we can on some of these so we can focus on what we have on the permanent collection reinstall and really focus on like maybe some of the most important offers we get. And then also we've been talking, Michael had said how they do very limited traveling shows. Well, we have decided while we do the permanent collection, we're really only doing traveling exhibitions or so that the permanent curatorial staff can focus for the next, couple of years on the permanent collection reinstall and have the time to focus on deep research and writing and not on exhibition planning. So those are just kind of a couple of strategies that we're taking. And we are lucky enough, we have 2 graduate curatorial assistants who each work 20 hours a week, and then we can hire undergraduate curatorial assistants to do some research. So.
But we can see the importance of also this institution as academies that really also focus on research and give you this time, or like at least valuing the research. And we have also more a question that, it's a comment, but I think we could turn it into a question. So it's from Rita. Are not most museum labels subjective? We take them as facts since we, the non-academics and public, view museum as the authority. And it goes back towards this question about labeling and also acknowledging some gaps in your knowledge, which I think you addressed in all your presentations. So if you can talk a little bit more about how that play out in the way you write, in the way also you think about your positions as experts.
Yeah, I think in that sense, I think it's about the tone. There are certain large civic museums that I go into, and the way that these labels are written just sounds like fact, even though I know this is subjective, but not everyone sort of enters into those museums with that critical lens. And so I think Michael mentioned this a little earlier about, being able to identify the authors or to identify the curators, to put a face or a tangible identity to the work that you're presenting. And so in my projects, I tend to make sure that the curator or co-curators are identified where possible. I love asking a question in the labels just to make it clear that you're inviting that discourse. And even when I'm presenting or conducting tours on these exhibitions, I am always offering the sort of introductory statement. These are my ideas, these are my interpretations, but I invite yours into this conversation as well, just to sort of break down that barrier between public and museum authority, and empower people to actually have an opinion as they go through the galleries.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'll just build on what Elizabeth was just saying about labels. Something that I also am really cognizant of is to try to never claim expertise. And if I'm giving a tour or if I'm teaching a class and someone asks me a question that I don't know, I say, I really don't know the answer to that question, but it's a really good question. I'd love to follow up with you about that at XYZ, right? And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But I think it's really important to state like what the limits of our knowledge are, so that we're not making presumptions or claiming things that might in fact actually be untrue. So
I'll just share that anecdotally as a teacher, I start my first day of class by saying that, in teaching a lecture on American art history, I endeavor to present as much as I possibly can, but I myself am a mediating force. So I select what goes in. It's not the full canon. And so I think we do have to enter into museums knowing that the history that's presented to us is a series of choices by people in a power relationship to the audience. But I'm happy that our panelists, humble themselves and are sort of revising these hierarchical relationships that have been tradition for so long.
Yes, and also showing a form of vulnerability, which is also not easy as experts. And also we have maybe last question, how to cultivate and retain audiences when presenting these new exhibitions. So maybe if you can talk about the reception of these works and exhibitions, and also expanding on what type of reception did you have, and the future of those exhibitions.
I guess I'll just say, like, Remancipation actually brought a whole lot of new attention and audience to the Chazen, because we were working with Stanford Biggers. He's a very well-known artist. It made like the New York Times. And so suddenly a lot of eyes were on the Chazen, this museum in Madison, Wisconsin. And so taking a chance and doing something different really, I think, helped us there. Previous to that, our temporary exhibition had been one co-curated by or curated by our colleagues at the university with the public history project or campus history project, where they were looking at sort of the history of inequality on campus. And that brought in a ton of alumni and people who really had never come to the museum before. So I think, I think it's important to take chances because you never know who will come who hasn't before. And we don't know what the reception will be like to the new permanent galleries. I mean, it's going to be a whole new way. I don't think I've ever seen a museum do this like on this scale of looking at art, and some visitor favorites either are going to be interpreted in a whole new way with completely different objects, or they're not going to be focus objects at all. And we don't know how they'll react, but we never know unless you try, right?
Would you like to add anything?
I'll also say that these exhibitions should not be one-off. I think there's definitely a big issue around sustainable practices in exhibitions like this. And Gwendolyn and Jennifer mentioned this earlier about this idea of, reviewing or revisiting as a cycle. And so I don't think that there should be reinstallations or revisiting the collection every 50 years or so. I think these are ongoing conversations because we need to learn from our past histories and the ways in which we interpreted things in prior exhibitions. And so it can't be on one curator who does this work, and then when they leave, all of the inspiration or motivation is now gone. And so I think it requires an institutional shift in priorities to retain that audience that you just built.
And do you see this institutional shift in your museum or in your experience as curators? How would you describe the response from the whole institution to your projects? Maybe to Elizabeth, but all of you, if you want to.
I'll jump back in just kind of on the last question a little bit and maybe propel us into that. I think that these types of shows do in many ways, I have found, cultivate a new audience, at least among students here. I think that Gwendolyn was talking about this specifically earlier today, that a lot of younger audiences want to only come and see contemporary art that speaks to maybe contemporary issues. And that is something that we deal with here on campus. What I have found, and now being here almost 3 years, is that whenever I started, not a lot of students wanted to come to my tours because I was like the white guy talking about old art. And I get that. I totally get that, right? But I think that there has now been maybe a little bit more trust built up through these conversations. And I do see students now, not as many, right, who are kind of coming to these midday talks and tours that we're doing that are typically more for our public audience, because we are also the regional museum in this area. So I'm excited to see that audience starting to be built here on campus, of students who are now interested more broadly in thinking about longer trajectories of history and what contemporary artists are working with, and especially those kind of looking to the past. I think that, we have had, some very vocal folks who don't like what we're doing. And you just kind of have to walk into that knowing that it's going to happen, right? Because it is. You, in no way can you ever please anyone. And I think what we're seeing is that maybe some of these folks who don't really like what we're doing are the people who, I think, come into museums to maybe reaffirm what they already know rather than a curiosity to learn something new. So part of that is on us to then think about how can we reframe how we're building exhibitions to spark that sort of curiosity, or provide, okay, here's some touch points that now let's go further, right? And I think that's one way that we do work, and we think about, how do we retain audiences that we already have and bring them along with us rather than alienating them. And I just also wanted to, this is from way back when, one civic museum that I think has been doing a really good job at these sorts of collections is the Peabody Essex. They just recently installed their American collections, and I think it's super effective. And, where we're doing maybe 2-year sort of installations, this one's a little bit longer. I think it's going to be up for 10 years, but they do have rotations that occur throughout. So the space does change and feel different. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something. This came up in Elizabeth's discussion and it resonates with something Michael just said, but in her presentation, Elizabeth spoke about using the canon or using the well-known artworks to tell new stories. And to Michael's point, you can use those well-known and well-loved artworks to sort of reaffirm people's experience with them and then sort of carry them into new understanding. So in that way, activating the permanent collection can be a way to both maintain or keep or provide a sort of a classical narrative that people love, but then sort of move them into new understandings of a work of art.
Anything else, or should I close the symposium and thank you all?
Well, Matilda, I think we have one more question.
Oh, sorry,
we have a few more minutes. Yeah, we can answer this last question.
Sorry, I didn't see this. So we have a question from Madeline. How do you recognize the history of the time with the reactions of current day political themes? Example, Thomas Ball, monument history is lost. It was African Americans who wanted and paid for the monument. Also, the kneeling person was modeled after a relative of Muhammad Ali. Has that history been preserved? I know many wasn't happy with the final version. So if you want to expand on that, comment.
Yeah, I think that was mostly directed towards my presentation. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I just want to point out that Mask initially sort of got back in contact with the Chazen after Boston decided to take down that monument, because they were like, Mask and Sanford, they were not satisfied with that as a resolution, right? It's not enough to just take these things off you. So I just want to acknowledge that that is actually part of the impetus for the whole project, right? How can we preserve these histories, acknowledge these histories, and then move the conversation forward? And I don't know that there's a good answer, and I don't think that one answer applies to everything or one answer applies to every monument, right? I think every case can be kind of different and it depends on the subject and the place, and I just want to acknowledge that. But to your specific point, in the exhibition, we addressed all of this history, right? That it was African Americans who raised funds for the Emancipation Memorial in DC. However, the committee that chose the design was all white. So that money was collected mostly by white people from formerly enslaved people, and then the white people decided what to do with it. We also, Frederick Douglass played a very large role in the exhibition and in Sanford Biggers's response piece, because Frederick Douglass criticized that monument as soon as it went up. So there was a contemporary criticism of the sculpture that has, so that criticism has been part of that sculpture's history from the second it was erected. And we included all of that information in the exhibition. Our particular sculpture was made before that monument. So ours is not modeled after Archer Alexander, who is the ancestor of Muhammad Ali. But you're right, the final memorial in DC was revised to include a portrait of a man named Archer Alexander. And so we told Archer Alexander's story in the exhibit. All of that has been preserved online. And I don't know what the city of Boston is going to do. I know the DC monument is still there. And so we wanted to make sure that all of those histories were included in the exhibition, as well as the perspective of the lead activist from Boston, Tori Bullock. He was one of our responders, whose story was incorporated in the exhibit and responses as well. He was the activist in Boston who started that petition and led the movement to have the Boston Memorial taken down. So we included his perspective as well. So I think that was how we wanted to preserve that history and include that as part of the discourse around what do we do, and the different responses to the sculptures that people could have based on their background. So